Beekeepers has a facility in Roseland at the Environmental Center, and I took a course. They offer a course every year. I took it about 10 years ago, and then it took me another 2 or 3 years to kind of get up the nerve to start my own beehives and do that kind of stuff. So it's been a long time coming, but I've been doing it full time for probably 4 or 5 years. I mean, as a hobby, and I really enjoy it. So I'm happy to share some ideas with you tonight and a little bit about beekeeping, and do jump in whenever you have a question. All right, so a couple of things about bees, bee facts. One is that 1 out of every 3 bites of food that we take is pollinated by bees. So if it weren't for the honeybee, there'd be a lot less food diversity. So the bees keep us alive rather than the other way around in many ways. And humans have been beekeeping for 10,000 years. And an interesting fact is that honey never spoils. That as long as it's airtight and it's not subjected to moisture or air, there was honey found in Tut's tomb that conceivably is still edible today. So it's kind of cool. And bees are amazing animals. They can carry their own weight in pollen and nectar, up to 3 miles back to the hive. So that's pretty cool. And it takes the nectar of 5 million flowers to produce 1 pint of honey.
Wow.
So there's a lot of work that goes into that jar of honey that we buy. And a bee will produce only 1/12 of a teaspoon of honey in its lifetime. And we'll talk about the fact that bees are really short-lived. I mean, the bees that are out there today working the hives are only going to last about 5 or 6 weeks before they're replaced by other bees that are being born every day. So they literally work themselves to death.
Wow.
And it takes 50,000 visits just to fill up one little honeybee cell with nectar. So it's a lot of work to produce the honey. And that bees they were sacred animals. They were considered symbols of life and fertility. And in fact, honey was so sacred that it was always given as a gift, and it wasn't sold commercially until the late 19th century or the early 20th century. So that's how important honey was to society. That it was only ever given as a gift. You couldn't buy it. So one thing to get straight up front is that bees are not wasps and they're not yellow jackets. So people always say I was stung by a bee or I'm allergic to bees. There's a lot of times what they're talking about is they were stung by a wasp or a yellow jacket. Bees are vegetarians, so they do not go after hot dogs or hamburgers at the picnic table. What those things are, which you see in the bottom photograph, is wasps or yellow jackets, but they do like soda. In fact, there was a case in Brooklyn a few years ago where a beekeeper got honey that was bright red, the honey, and had no idea what the nectar source was. And it turns out that he was about a mile away from a factory that made maraschino cherries. And the bees got into the syrup, and they brought it home to the hive, and they made red-colored honey. So, and bees will very, very rarely sting away from the beehive. Bees will only sting to protect their home. So, if they're visiting a flower, or you see them away from the hive, you literally almost have to step on them to get stung by a bee. And bees die when they sting. So, unlike other insects that can sting you multiple times, they will only sting you as a last resort to defend themselves or defend the beehive. So again, a lot of what people think they got stung by a bee, it's really almost always a yellow jacket or a hornet. All right, so Apis mellifera is the genus and species for the honeybee. So insects are the most dominant expression on Earth. There's 686,000 different species of insects, of which I think 8,200. I got the comma misplaced. Live in North America, and let me see if I can hide this. All right, here we go. You guys can still hear me, right?
Yes.
All right, great. I had to hide the photograph so I could see the presentation. So if you picture a piece of rope 45 meters long, which is 148 feet, and each meter represents 10 million years, right? So if you think about 10 times 45 is 450 million years, That's the point at which the Earth is recognizable in its current form. 13 meters from the end is when the bees arrive. So about 130 million years ago, the bees began to develop along with flowering plants, right? Which makes sense because nature says there's a need for plants to propagate. So then it's almost like the bees came to address that need. Humans turn up less than 1 centimeter from the end. So isn't that amazing, right? Humans have only been around between 1.6 and 2.4 million years, but the bees have been around for 130 million years. So the bees have been around a lot longer than we have, even though we've coexisted for a long time. And bees have learned to obtain food. So nectar for them is carbohydrates, and pollen is equal to fats and protein and vitamins for them. And here's, so the history of beekeeping. So people have been beekeeping for 10,000 years. And there is a Arana in Spain. They found cave paintings of people actually, doing the beekeeping. And these are actual cave sketches from Spain. And the other one is from India. The one on the right is from India. The one on the left is from Spain. All right, so the history of beekeeping. So if you think about it, right, it's so easy. We so take for granted the fact that sugar is readily available to us as humans. And we just go to the store and buy Domino's sugar or buy white sugar or brown sugar. But if you think about it, honey, along with dates and in the New World, sorghum and maple syrup, was one of the very, very few sources of sweetness in the world in the days before cane and corn sugar were propagated and become readily available. So as a result, almost everybody kept beehives as a source of something that was sweet. And so honey was also used to make mead, which is an alcoholic beverage made from honey and water. And they would also use it to dress wounds because honey, as we'll find out, is very antiseptic in its properties. And until movable frames were invented, and we'll talk about what that means, in the 1850s by a gentleman named Lorenzo Langstroth, bees were kept in skeps. And I have pictures of skeps in the presentation, so you'll see what they look like. But what would happen was the bees would often have to be destroyed every year in order to obtain the honey. They'd actually have to smoke the bees out with sulfur and kill the bees, and then they would crush the comb to obtain the honey. So it was kind of a very crude process, but that's what people did. And people used to beeline. So we've all heard the term beelining. What that means is that bees fly in a completely straight direction. So people would put out like little bits of anise or honey or sugar, and bees would come get them, and they would fly in a straight line back to their cave, back to their nest. So people would actually follow the bees, and they would follow the straight line. That they would set up more sugar, and they would eventually find the bee cavity, which was the hollow in a tree trunk, and they would use that to basically cut the tree down and take all the honey. So again, it was very crude back in the day, but that's what people did to obtain honey. All right, so bees in America. So honeybees are not native to the US, which is very interesting. They were brought over from Europe in the 1600s with the settlers. And the Native Americans used to call bees the white man's flies because when they saw bees appear, they knew that the white man was not far behind. That's interesting, right? So honey hunters would scout in the early spring. Again, they would use beelining to find out where the bee trees were, and then they would harvest the honey in the fall. And again, they often destroyed the beehive when they were getting the honey, and they did not leave bees enough stores to survive the winter, which again is not really good animal stewardship, but people did what they had to do to obtain the honey. And so over time, settlers they learned how to keep bees in skeps or in bee gums, which are kind of sections of tree where the bees would live. But even then, many of the bees would die after the harvest until, again, Lorenzo Langstroth invented what we all know now as a bee frame. And I would just reference, I think what's fascinating is back in the 1970s, there was a series of books developed called the Foxfire Guides. And I think it was somebody in Georgia as a class for his high school students. He had people go into Appalachia and speak to people about the old ways of doing things. And again, this book talks about hog dressing, building log cabins, planting by nature's signs, that kind of stuff. So these people, it's an oral history of Appalachia And it resulted in 12 volumes of Foxfire guides. And beekeeping specifically is featured in volumes 2 and 11. And it's really fascinating. You can either get these online, or you can go to the Glen Ridge Library and look at the Foxfire books. And it's just really cool to just read about the oral history of people from down south. It was really, really cool. So just a little shout out for the library if you ever want to check out the Foxfire guides. All right, so bee trees, right? So the natural home of the bees is the hollow of a tree, because if you think about it, it's got 6 or 7 inches of wood. It's a defendable area. Now, what I'm showing you on the left-hand side is a tree that's in Montclair. It's in Upper Montclair. A good friend of mine lives there. And that little, right above the picture on the right is an enlargement of a hole in the tree right above on the left, where you can see where the telephone line is. So that is a bee tree. Bees live there continually, and they get swarms every year from that tree. And that again is the natural home for the bee, because there's a finite amount of space there. It's, no bear is going to climb up 30 feet to get to the bees. That's generally where they live. So even in a place, well, especially in a place like Glen Ridge or Verona, where there's a lot of old trees around, you have feral colonies living all over the place, which is interesting. All right, so when people think of beehives, they think about these things, right? They think that bees constructed these structures, but no, these were constructed by man to house the bees, and they're called skeps. You'll see skeps all over the place. So that's what a skep looks like. It's made out of straw, and it's kind of a perfect shape for the bees to take up residence and to be kept in them. So before they invented the movable beehive, bees were kept in skeps. And that's the interior of a skep. You'll see some crossed sticks, which allow the bees to build comb on those sticks. And then this is a picture from Salt Lake City. So the beehive is the symbol of Utah, the state of Utah, because bees were considered very industrious creatures. They were considered the symbol of industry. And also they were the symbol of thrift. So a lot of times you'll see beehives as a symbol for banking. So the Provident Bank in New Jersey, their symbol is a beehive. And I throw this out there also because I know I have a couple of friends from King's College, where I went to school. Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, the symbol of Wilkes-Barre is a beehive. So and that's on the police cars. So just a shout out to Wilkes-Barre. So this is what a beehive looks like. Okay, so on the top you've got a feral beehive, which is if the bees build in the wild. Usually they build in the hollow of a tree, like I said, but sometimes a swarm can't find a better place to live, and they will actually build out in the open. It's not too common here in the Northeast because it gets cold, but that does happen. And then in the bottom you have what's a managed beehive, or what we call the Langstroth hive. So a honeybee hive is made of wax, and the wax is sculpted into perfect hexagonal cells. And the bees are master builders. They build exactly straight down according to gravity. And the cells provide storage. So each one of these hexagonal cells, something is stored in there. So either larvae, which is a baby bee, is going to be stored in there, or pollen, which again is the protein of the hive, or honey, which is the carbohydrates. They're all stored in these cells, and they're constantly rearranged according to the bee's needs. So a lot of times, like if a larvae hatches out, they'll take that cell and they'll fill it up with honey, especially at this time of the year when a lot of nectar is coming in. And so wax is the liver of the hive, and the wax takes a lot of energy to create an effort. So we try to preserve the wax as much as possible, because that's what sustains the hive. So here's the modern what we call the Langstroth beehive, and this is kind of a cutaway of what's contained in those boxes. So they're all symmetrical boxes with 10 vertical frames hanging down, and the frames are where the bees build the comb, and that's where they have larvae or pollen or honey they store in there. So basically the deep boxes are where the larvae are kept, or the baby bees, and that's kind of what the bees need for the winter. So if you think about it, the bottom 2 boxes are always going to be on the hive, because that's the honey that the bees need, and the pollen and the larvae that keep them going. And then anything above those two top boxes are what are called supers, from the Latin word meaning above. You would place them above the brood boxes, and that's essentially where the honey is stored. So the boxes on top would be for the beekeeper, and the boxes on the bottom would be for the bees. And that's the agreement, is that basically you're providing bees with a house and lodging, and in order to, you kind of earn a return on the rent is in the form of honey. But you always want to leave bees at least 60 to 80 pounds of honey to get through the winter, because honey is their winter food. They do not consume honey like at this time of the year because there's enough nectar coming in. They don't need to consume the honey. Okay. All right, so the members of the hive. So this time of the year, there's up to 60,000 bees in a hive at full strength. And 80% of them are worker bees, which are always female. And 20% of the hive is drones, which are male. And you've got only one queen for the hive that basically, the queen is not the controller of the hive. As we'll see later, bees make decisions democratically. There's a thing called the honeybee democracy, where they all make decisions together. So the queen is actually the servant of the entire hive, because she basically exists at the pleasure of the hive, and when she gets old or she stops producing enough good larvae, they will supersede the queen and raise a new queen up. So it's kind of all about the needs of the hive over the needs of the individual. So all 60,000 bees are needed for survival. And so rather than 60,000 individual bees, you've got one superorganism, because bees cannot survive on their own. They need the hive to survive. Unlike some other kinds of bees like mason bees or bumblebees, which are basically solitary, bees are social creatures. All right, so, and again, the word queen is a misnomer. She is really the servant of the entire hive. Her job is to lay up to 2,000 eggs a day, and when she gets old or falters, she will be replaced. So nature is kind of harsh in some ways, and that's the reality of the queen. And so drones are interesting because they're freeloaders. Drones are male bees. They do not collect honey. They do not collect nectar. They're tolerated by the bees because their only job is to mate with queens from other hives. So every day the drones fly to what they call drone congregation areas in midair, and they wait for virgin queens from other hives to arrive, and their job is to basically mate with them. And they're tolerated by bees. They're fed by the worker bees because they perform this very important function. But the reality is that, so basically they're freeloaders in the sense that they don't produce anything, but they take resources from the hive. But when a drone mates with the queen, his sexual organs are ripped out and he dies after that. And also when the autumn comes and the queen stops laying because they're preparing for winter, when the queen stops laying, there's no more need for drones. So the drones are actually dragged out of the hive by the worker bees to die outside because there's no more need for them. So actually there's drones. There are no drones. There's a handful of drones that survive the winter, but essentially hives going into autumn have no drones because they don't want to expend resources on things they don't need. And in fact, in the spring, when you start seeing drones again, that's when it shows you that swarm season is upon us. And here's a picture of, you can see the worker bee is physically smaller. The queen's got that very long abdomen, and her wings are actually as long as a worker bee's, but they just look shorter because her abdomen is so long. And you've got the drone, which is actually, they're almost as large as a queen, and they've got those two compound eyes that meet in the middle. And drones cannot sting you. So, you can actually pick up a drone and handle it, and it would be unable to sting you. And there's a picture of a queen bee surrounded by her coterie of workers. Basically, the queen, her job is to lay eggs, but she is fed by the workers, and all of her needs are taken care of by the worker bees. All right, so the honeybee duties are broken down into a very specific sequence from birth into death. So 1 to 2 days after emerging, the bees will clean cells and they'll keep the other brood warm. 3 to 5 days, they will feed the old larvae, meaning the larvae that are ready to hatch. From 6 to 11 days, they will feed the younger larvae. From 12 to 17 days, they have the ability in their glands to produce wax. So these are the bees that, in order for bees to build wax, they have to be a very certain age, only 12 to 17 days. So you need bees of that age in order to produce wax. They'll carry food, and actually they'll do undertaker duties. So bees are very clean animals. They will not defecate in the hive. They go outside to basically relieve themselves, and they will not tolerate dead bees in the hive. So if a bee dies in the hive, another bee will take it out, which is a big undertaking, right? Because you've got to carry another bee of your own weight, and you've got to physically drag it out of the hive. But you'll see that all the time, especially in the winter. In the spring, the bees will take all the dead bees out of the hive. From 18 to 21 days, you've got guard bees, which are guarding the hive entrance against predators like wax moths or small hive beetles or bees from other hives. And then from 22 days plus, you've got foraging bees. So they'll begin flying from the hive. They'll be pollinating plants. They'll be collecting pollen, nectar, and water. So from basically 3 weeks to 6 weeks, the bees are foraging, and then they die. And then usually in October and November, the queen begins laying winter bees, which are biologically able to survive a 3 to 4 month lifespan until the next cycle begins.
Jim, if I can interrupt you, there's a question. Where do the drones winter? How do they come back?
Well, they really don't winter. I mean, you might have 1 or 2% of bees in the wintertime being drones, down from 20%. But usually most of them just die. But the bees rule themselves by the seasons of the sun, the cycles of the sun. So they're very aware, like the solstice, the winter solstice, December 21st, is their day of, like, basically there's no brood in the hive. It's the day of, it's kind of like the low point of the year. But when the hive realizes that the days are getting longer, the queen will begin to lay again, and she will lay she'll lay drones in order to get ready for the next swarm season, and to propagate. And what's interesting is that she's not laying drones for herself, because once the queen goes out on her mating flight, it's like basically once she goes out on a one-day mating flight, and she'll mate with 15 or 20 drones, and she'll get enough sperm to lay 2,000 eggs a day for the rest of her life. So once the queen comes back to the hive, she never leaves again. But she will lay drones for the survival of other hives. It's just part of the species, the way it goes. So I hope that makes sense. So let's talk about foraging behaviors. So bees will forage within a 3-mile radius, looking for nectar, pollen, and water. And they'll, generally they'll do 10 trips of 1 hour apiece, especially this time of year when the day is so long. They basically work all the time. And what's ironic is, like, the hope is that the bees that are at A Lot to Grow in Glen Ridge pollinate the crops that are right in front of them. But a lot of times bees will, like, once they find out a nectar source, they communicate it to the other bees through what's called like the waggle dance. They'll go back to the hive and they'll communicate, pointing out the direction of the sun and the distance where the good nectar source is. And sometimes they will ignore what's right in front of them and go to forage at a place that's like a mile away. So there's really no rhyme or reason to it sometimes. So foragers will be bringing, at this point, 70% nectar or carbs and 30% pollen or protein. And we're going to see a picture, I think, of pollen. Pollen is an actual physical substance that's carried on the legs of the worker bees returning to the hive. So they'll be laden down with pollen. You can physically see pollen coming into the hive. You can't see nectar because it's internal. The bees kind of suck it up, so you really can't see the nectar coming in, but you can definitely see pollen coming in. So the pollen foragers make 50 flights per day. They'll visit 350 flowers per flight. So it's a pretty amazing when you do the math, right? You see how much work goes into even producing a pint of honey. You have a lot more respect for it. Nectar foragers will make 30 flights a day, and they'll visit 1,500 flowers per flight. And again, a full load of nectar can be 85% of a bee's weight. So it's pretty intense. All right, and so if you can see right there, I don't know if you can see my pointer. That's pollen on a bee's legs. So a lot of times, if you observe a beehive entrance in the morning, you will see a lot of bees bringing pollen back to the hive. And the pollen has different colors depending on what kind of flower they visit. And you can actually get a pollen chart where based on the shade of pollen, it'll let you know what flowers they're visiting, which is pretty cool. All right, so here's a year in beekeeping in New Jersey. So basically, right now is prime time for the bees. So New Jersey is a very short, actually the Middle Atlantic state has a very short nectar season. We're basically May through the middle of July, and then it shuts down. Sometimes there's a secondary flow in the fall, but basically we've got 2.5 months to make it. And that's why when we talk about swarming, there's an old saying that says it goes like this: a swarm in May is worth a bale of hay, a swarm in June is worth a silver spoon, but a swarm in July isn't worth a fly. And the reason for them saying that is because swarms in May and June, they have a chance to build up because the main nectar flow is happening, so they can put away enough resources to get through the winter. But if a hive swarms in July, a lot of times the flow is over, and without human intervention, they're not going to survive because they won't be able to build up in time to survive the winter. So July and August is a dearth in this area. So there's a lot of robbing behavior. Bees are very opportunistic. In some ways, they're very selfless, but in some ways, they're very opportunistic. And a lot of times, stronger hives will rob the weaker hives of honey and basically kill the hive off because there's not a lot of nectar going on in July and August in this area. And then September, there is a fall flow. It depends on the year, but a lot of times goldenrod or star thistle or Japanese knotweed, which is an invasive plant, but is actually an excellent nectar source. That's what's going on in the autumn. And then in November through January, the hive is going to shut down. So if it gets above 45 degrees, the bees will fly out of the hive again on cleansing flights because they don't go to the bathroom in the hive. They'll go out and relieve themselves on cleansing flights, but basically they stay in the hive from November and through January. And then again, based on the calendar and the solstice, the queen will begin to lay again around February. And then the nectar flow starts with dandelions in this area and skunk cabbage in those sources, and it ends with goldenrod. So basically, once the dandelion hits, the whole cycle starts all over again, and the queen begins to lay brood. The hive gets crowded, the hive will swarm, and the queen will lay more bees. They'll go out and collect more pollen and nectar, and the whole thing starts all over again. Okay, so a year in beekeeping. A beehive needs about 70 pounds of honey to get through the winter. Again, honey is their winter food. They do not consume it except for the winter time. So April through November, the hive lives on nectar, which is their carbohydrate, the pure nectar that they bring in. And November through April, the hive consumes honey. All right, so what's the difference between nectar and honey? So nectar is the pure sweet stuff that comes from plants. It's very watery. So what they'll do is the bees will bring nectar in, and other bees in the hive with their wings will flap the nectar down to dehydrate it to 18 to 20% moisture content. Now, once it's less than 20% moisture content, they will cap that cell over with beeswax, and then that becomes honey. So that's how nectar becomes honey, and I have pictures of that later on in the presentation. So anybody who's into biodynamic beekeeping or farming, I took a course with a place called the Spikenard Honeybee Sanctuary down in Virginia, and these folks are into biodynamic farming, which follows the teachings of Rudolf Steiner, who was a German philosopher. Really interesting. And Steiner actually developed the Waldorf schools. Anybody who knows Waldorf school system, he was also kind of the father of that system. So they're really cool people, interesting, and they do things based on planetary alignment. So anybody who knows about biodynamic farming, root days are the best days to visit bees. They generally have the best behavior on root days. So I actually have an app on my phone, which is a biodynamic calendar, and sometimes I try to time my visits around the root days. All right, so what's hurting the bees? Everyone who meets me knows the same thing, right? They're saying, why are the bees dying? You know, how come, what's up with colony collapse disorder? How come there's a lot, you know, saving the bees is a big, it's a big cause celeb. So let's talk about what's causing stress for the bees. Now, anybody who bought Cheerios a couple years ago, they had like their mascot, I think Buzzy the Bee or Buzz, he disappeared off the box. And there was this whole hashtag about bring back the bees. And they were saying, if you know, if you send us an email, we'll send you, we have 100 million wildflower seed packages that you could throw in your field, and then it's going to grow wildflower seeds, and it's going to help the pollinators. The ironic fact is that a lot of those seed packages contain non-native species of flowers in certain areas. So it kind of, in some ways, it did more harm than good in an effort to try to do good from the Cheerios people. So first of all, honeybees are not the only pollinators out there. And I want to give a shout out. They're the most popular ones, right? They're kind of like the Kardashians of the insect world, but they're not the only, by far, they're not the only pollinators out there. So there's 4,000 other bee species living in North America. You've got like the bumblebees and the mason bees. And a lot of those species are a lot more endangered than honeybees are. And yet, because they don't have a lot of PR agents, they don't get a lot of recognition. Most of these are solitary bees. They're stingless, and they nest in the ground as opposed to nesting in hives like bees do or in trees. And many of them are specialty pollinators. So you have like fig wasps. You've got pollinators that only do blueberries. You've got ones that only do squash. You've got orchard bees. So it's really pretty interesting. So for instance, only a bumblebee can pollinate tomatoes. Honeybees are not large enough to pollinate the tomato plant. So that's a specialty thing that nature's developed, which is interesting, right? So, and again, these other pollinators face even greater threats than the honeybee. And I just want to point this out because there's a big, like, you know, the internet blows everything up. And there's people that are saying we shouldn't look out for the honeybees at all because they're an invasive species. They're not invasive, like the spotted lanternfly or like the murder hornet that we see, you know, around all the time. Honeybees are non-native, meaning that they're not native to the US. They were brought here by the settlers, but they're not invasive species. They're very, very good for agriculture, and they're very good for our environment. So I just want to just point that out. All right, so honeybees face a lot of pests. Number one pest is the varroa mite, which is that little guy that you see right there. It's very small, but if you think about it, scaled to the size of a human, it's like a dinner plate on a human body. That's how big the varroa mite is. And it basically sucks the blood of the bee and transmits diseases and leads to a lot of the colony collapse that we see. So the varroa mite is kind of enemy number one. It was introduced, it actually existed it existed alongside an Asian bee, not Apis mellifera, but Apis cerana, I think. And they were able to exist peacefully, more or less. It's a host parasite relationship, but they're able to live with them. But once the varroa mite got into the honeybee, it began to kill off a lot of colonies. So this is something that we've been dealing with since 1983 in America, and it's the number one cause of like beehives dying. And there are ways to treat the varroa mite, either organically or not organically, that basically commercial beekeepers have to do in order to make a living. Because if you didn't treat for the varroa mite, you basically couldn't sustain a couple thousand colonies to do pollination, which we'll get into later. So there's other kind of things like foul brood, nosema, the wax moth, which you see down here. So the wax moth and hive beetles are kind of things where they don't cause bees to collapse, but they take advantage of weak colonies and they basically like make a hive uninhabitable, and they'll kill off the remaining bees. So the bees face a lot of diseases and pests that we as beekeepers have to worry about. So this is Varroa destructor. That's enemy number one. Again, came in the 80s from Asia. Apparently, Australia, New Zealand, and Hawaii are the only places on Earth that do not have the varroa mite, which is why you cannot import any honeybee colonies into those areas, because they don't want the mite coming into their areas, you know, basically devastating their hives. And it's mostly controlled through the use of chemicals, either organic, things like formic or oxalic acid, or through really heavy chemicals like amitraz and coumaphos, are things that are like super like bad chemicals that a lot of times commercial beekeepers use because that's their living and they can't risk not having bees to pollinate crops. So it's no judgment on them, but there is some pretty heavy stuff used to control bees, which wind up a lot of times in commercial honey that you buy in the stores, which is a reason maybe to like buy local honey, I would say. And so let's think about the industrialization of the honeybee. And again, I'm getting a lot into like, a lot of what I learned from the biodynamic folks and the Rudolf Steiner people. But that picture is the picture of a skep, right? The honeybees of old, where they were kept in very small colonies, very controlled environments, and they were more or less kept in line with nature. So Lorenzo Langstroth, who was a Presbyterian minister and was actually born in Philadelphia. There's a plaque on the street in Philly where he was born. He discovered bee space. So bee space is 3/8 of an inch. So what does that mean? What it means is that less than 3/8 of an inch, bees really can't move a whole lot. More than 3/8 of an inch, they will build comb because they're very industrious. So if you space your combs 3/8 of an inch apart, the bees will be able to move around, but they won't be able to build comb. And he discovered this through observation, and that's what led to the invention of the movable frames, those 10 frames that we saw in that box earlier. So Langstroth is really the father, so to speak, of modern beekeeping, because up until then, most bees were kept in skeps or tree gums, bee gums. So this is around the time the Industrial Revolution was taking place. And so bees began to be managed for yield, and they were manipulated just like other crops. And we kind of like, just like, trying to maximize the yield of soybeans or corn, we're like, well, how do we maximize the yield of honey so that we can get the most honey per hive? And I think we've lost a sense of the sacred of what honeybees were all about, and the fact that you couldn't even buy honey before the 19th century because it was considered that special. And so we've begun to treat bees just like other crops, which is kind of lamentable in a way. So what they've done is bees left to their own devices will build foundation. The size of that little cell would be 4.9 millimeters. What they started doing is they started pre-printing foundation of 5.4 millimeters. And what they're saying is if we force the bees to build bigger cells, we're going to get more honey because bigger cells equals more honey. But the problem is that by making them build a bigger cell, you create a larger bee. The larger bee has a bigger throat, and now things like tracheal mites can inhabit the throat of the honeybee. And then a larger bee can't get inside of certain flowers. They can't pollinate certain flowers. So we had unintended consequences to the industrialization of the honeybee. And then the present day, a lot of times, like you'll go to Home Depot and you'll see a flower of a certain color. Right, so bees kind of guide themselves by UV light, and a lot of times they will engineer a flower to be a certain color because it's attractive to us. But the flower also looks attractive to honeybees because honeybees traditionally see that flowers of that color have nectar available and pollen, and they go to visit the flower only to realize that because the flower has been engineered, there's no nectar or pollen available. So it kind of sends off the wrong signal. So these are all things that like unintended consequences that we don't think about. All right, so the primary factors in honeybee loss. One is monoculture. So this is the original sin of agriculture, is that you destroy the natural cycle of things like planting cover crops and rotating crops, and then you artificially put all that stuff back that you took out through supplements. So think about what they call NPK farming, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. In Rudolf Steiner saw this coming because if you think about it, after World War I, a lot of factories geared up to produce nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium for the war effort, for making things like, basically munitions, right? And so after the war was over, these factories were still cranking this stuff out, but they had no natural use for it. So they basically convinced the farmers to listen, you can get greater yield by, don't worry about rotating crops or planting cover crops. Just buy supplements from us and put this in your field and you're going to grow better crops and bigger yields, right? So but that resulted in basically modern farming, which is a wasteland for most bees, and we're going to see that. So we've got habitat loss and decreased floral diversity, right? When I was growing up, everybody had clover and dandelion on their lawns, and it was just something that we lived with, right? And now, and I'm guilty of it too, like everybody wants the perfect lawn. You get the landscaper in, and it's not right to have dandelions and clover on your lawn, even though these things are immensely beneficial for honeybees and for other pollinators. And as a matter of fact, if you look on the internet, 100 years ago, people would plant dandelion seeds. They were so sought after as like for their medicinal properties and food properties that people would actually cultivate dandelions. And somehow, politically or society-wise, we no longer favor things like clover and dandelions. And also New Jersey, right? A lot of stuff has gotten blacktopped over. There's been a lot of development that used to have trees and stuff like that, and fields. A lot of Cedar Grove, right, was farms, and now it's houses. And so there's a lot less stuff for bees to forage on. So habitat loss is a big deal. No cover crops, right? The fence rows and the cover crops in farming are all gone. And basically bees will starve in a continuous cornfield. In most modern farming, because of NPK, they're food deserts. And it used to be in the old days, right, at least you'd have fence rows with something for bees like alfalfa or clover, but there's nothing like that for them anymore, and it's difficult. Which is why, ironically, like I went to a talk from the Philadelphia Beekeeping Guild not too long ago, and the guy was saying that bees in Philadelphia have a lot more honey and are a lot healthier than bees in Lancaster County because of all the industrial farming out there. And it's the exact opposite of what you would think, right? Migratory beekeeping. Almonds is a huge crop for bees. In fact, the almond crop needs 1 million beehives to pollinate the almond crop in California. And but there's the nectar there's no nectar, and the pollen is a very, very poor quality in almonds. So that basically, it doesn't do any good for the bees. It makes them sick. And we'll get into that. And neonicotinoids, right? Most of Europe has banned neonicotinoids. They were meant to decrease the need for open spraying, but these are things where actual pesticides are part of the seed. When you plant the seed, like the Monsanto seed, the seed itself has the pesticide embedded in it, and it grows up along with the crop, and it is not good for the bees or the pollinators whatsoever. Okay, so we get the idea that it was meant to decrease the need for open spraying, but it hasn't done much good for the bees. And finally, like the glyphosate herbicides, Roundup, which we're all kind of getting to the point where society is realizing that Roundup's a bad thing, very, very bad for bees and other pollinators. All right, so here's
Jim, sorry if I can interrupt. There was
Yep.
one question on the last slide. What is a root day? Does one hive provide sufficient honey for the bees to overwinter?
Yeah, so one hive will provide sufficient honey for bees to overwinter. Again, they need 60 to 80 pounds. And really the whole point of honeybee management or beekeeping is to kind of cajole the bees. Bees are very industrious, and they hate space above their head. If there's vacant space, they need to fill it up with beeswax and nectar and pollen. So the art of beekeeping is almost like convincing the hive to produce more honey than they need, and then taking a share for yourself. That's essentially how it works. Now, root days.
Two.
Pardon me?
That's a good thing too. Oh gosh, sorry.
Okay, so root days. I'm not super familiar. Like, all I know is that the nature's calendar, according to biodynamic farming, is broken up into like leaf days and root days. There's 4 or 5 different kinds of days, and each day, if you look at it like a Stellantoric calendar, is broken up into one of those kinds of days. And I wish I knew more about it, but if you do a quick Google search, it goes back to ancient times, and in the way that people used to plant according to the seasons of the sun. So it's kind of cool. All right, so what are we seeing here? On the left-hand side, we're seeing a truck that's loaded down with beehives. And so most commercial beekeepers don't make money selling honey. They make money because farmers pay them to pollinate crops. And again, they start with the almond crop in February in California. So beekeepers from New Jersey will actually take their hives across country to pollinate the almond crop. And that's like a 2-week pollination. Once the almond crop is over, they will travel to do almonds or blueberries or cranberries or squash or pumpkins. So they'll travel around to pollinate the different kinds of crops. But what you do is when you bring 1 million hives together that are, imagine being on the road, right? All year long, you're on the road. Every 2 or 3 weeks, you're in a different spot. You're encountering bees from other areas. You're stressed out and you're sick. And it's very, very easy to pass diseases along among the bees because of, basically migratory beekeeping. And then like soybean fields, like you see on the right, it looks very, very healthy, but using commercial fertilizer and NPK farming, they're basically food deserts for honeybees. There's nothing for honeybees to pollinate or to eat in that entire, rows upon row and state upon state of crops. And again, it's not a judgment. It's just kind of the way it is, All right, so let's talk about swarming, which is, we're getting to the heart of like what a lot of people in Glen Ridge might have seen this year. So the way that bees propagate themselves is through swarming, right? In April and May, again, picture the typical spot for a bee. The typical house is the hollow of a tree, which has a finite amount of space. So the weather warms up, the queen begins to lay again. She's laying brood. The bees are bringing nectar in, they're bringing pollen in. So that space is getting filled up with stuff, and the hive is running out of room. So again, the bees collectively decide that we're going to swarm, and they begin to send scouts out looking for places where that would be a good permanent home for them. So approximately 30 to 50% of the hive will leave with the old queen, and a new queen is raised by the hive. So she emerges and she goes on mating flights. She will mate with between 8 and 30 different drones in the first 2 weeks of her life on these mating flights. And again, she will meet them in these drone congregation areas, which are these areas in midair, which are determined only by nature. I mean, the bees seem to know where they are, but it's kind of amazing to me that basically the queen knows where the drones are. The drones know where the queens are. They get together and they mate, and then once the queen comes back, she'll return to the hive and never leave again. And she'll have enough to lay 2,000 eggs per day for up to 5 years, which is pretty amazing. And again, drones die after they mate, and only 30% of swarms survive. So if you think about like a swarm in July isn't worth a fly, the nature's not kind, and a lot of times they don't have enough resources to survive by the time that fall rolls around. So that's why by hoping to capture swarms and to trap them and put them in managed colonies, we try to help people out. All right, so here's some pictures. These are actual pictures from Glen Ridge and Montclair from 2020. And I don't know if anybody on the call has experienced this, but we had swarms all over the place this year. So why was it such an active swarm season? Okay, so think about it, right? We had a very, very mild winter, and this allowed the beehives to build up early. And in fact, swarm season was a full month before the normal swarm date of May 1st. And that surprised a lot of beekeepers, including me, and including the hives had a lot to grow. They both swarmed. So almost every hive had what's called a primary swarm, which is the original queen leaving with about 30% of the hive. And several of them had after swarms. So what happens is, when it's swarm season, the hive, because bees are very resourceful and they do a lot of planning, they make several queen cells. And usually when the old queen leaves, the first new queen to emerge will kill all the other queens. So she's the only queen remaining in the hive. But if that doesn't happen, you'll get several virgin queens emerge from the hive, and they will all swarm with about like 30% of the remaining hive. So a hive can literally swarm itself out of existence in a season like this, and that's kind of what happens. So it's funny that I thought the picture on the left is from Montclair, North Mountain Avenue in Montclair, and the picture on the right comes from that bee tree that I showed you earlier in the presentation. And it's as simple as swarms are very docile because they're looking for a home. They're kind of like zoned out because they gorge on honey before they swarm, and they're really not aggressive at all. I know that's hard to believe, but you could take your bare hand and touch that cluster of bees and not get stung because they have no hive to defend. So they're very, very docile. So literally what I did with both of these swarms is I took a spackle bucket and I shook the tree really hard, and all the bees fell into the spackle bucket, and I dumped it into a traditional beehive. And both of these swarms are living today in managed colonies. So it's pretty cool.
Jim,
All
we
right.
got another question. You sort of touched on this, but do bees actually pick a new queen, or is it self-selection? How does that work?
They will raise queen cells, and usually what they'll do is in order to raise queen cells, and this is getting into a little bit more than what I know, but they will take a regular worker cell and they will feed it royal jelly, an abundance of what's called royal jelly, which is like a kind of a super protein substance. And by giving it extra royal jelly, that's what turns a worker cell into a queen cell. And usually hives will produce queen cells as a backup plan in case the queen dies. But so usually what will happen is the first queen to emerge from a queen cell will kill all the other queens within the queen cells. She's the only one left. So they really don't choose the queen per se, but they have a loyalty to the queen that emerges, you know? All right, so what is this? So these little things that look like little tan bullets almost, this is brood. So this is capped brood. So these are cells that are about to emerge as new bees. And this stuff here is a beautiful frame of capped honey. So again, this is nectar that's been dried down to the right moisture content, and the bees will cap it with beeswax, and that is pure honey. So you can harvest that, which we'll see how does the honey make it into the jar, what we're going to see in a minute. And again, this is a close-up of the brood. So if you look here, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but see that this real little larva that's 1 or 2 days old. This is a larger larva that's maybe 5 or 6 days old. And then when the larva gets to a certain age, the bees will cap that cell, and it looks like this. All right. And these are worker bees helping out the larva and tending to them.
Jim, I have
Yep, go ahead.
a couple of questions. Do you want to take them now?
Yeah.
So follow up to how do the bees pick a new queen was asked, will the new swarm form a hive?
Yeah, so the new swarm. So here's an example of, and if you go back to, so this is a hive that obviously decided to swarm, right? They're hanging in a tree branch. And what they're going to do now is they're going to send scout bees out from this cluster to look for like a new permanent home, which is ideally maybe a box that I've set up that has frames hanging in it, that has the right scent of a queen bee that they'll just move right into, or they could move into into the hollow of a tree, or they could move into somebody's roof. A lot of times people have bees living in their attic for years that they may or may not know about. And then there's constantly bees in that attic. Now that doesn't mean that the same swarm lasts for 20 or 30 years. A lot of times the bees will die out and new bees will move in. But but again, nature is cruel. So on a beautiful day like this, they're out looking for a permanent home. But we could have 30-degree weather, or it could rain. You could have torrential rainstorms, and those bees could potentially die before they find a new home. So that's why only 30% of swarms really survive in the wild.
And then the other question that came up was, how does a queen kill other queens? Sorry.
She has a stinger, and she actually, a queen will not sting a human being, but she has a stinger that she can use and reuse to kill other queens. So yeah, okay. She has a stinger. She really never uses it other than for kind of queenly duties of killing off her rivals, but she kills it. She kills them that way.
Okay, thanks.
All right. So ways of obtaining. So if you want to become a new beekeeper, some ways of obtaining bees. Again, you can capture a swarm in the wild. Again, if you're lucky enough to find one and shake it into a spackle bucket, you're in business. Or I have several of these. These are swarm traps. So they're simple wooden boxes that have frames hanging in them that are the right size. So bees look for a cavity of about 40 liters in size to swarm into. And so that's the right size. It's got a little hole that they can easily defend. So these are boxes that are traditionally attractive to bees. And the hope is that you can have a swarm move in there and not have to worry about somebody calling you to say, go gather a swarm. You can kind of collect them at your convenience. And I have maybe 7 or 8 of these around Glen Ridge and in Montclair, in Cedar Grove, and I've done very well with them. And I have partners, people that sponsor these swarm boxes for me, where they're very vigilant about looking at the box and say, we have activity today. I think a swarm moved in. And then I'll come check it out. And then after sundown, when all the bees are back home, I will physically take that box and move it to one of the permanent apiaries, like either in Glen Ridge or Montclair. And then sometimes you can buy packages of bees. So the traditional way to start beekeeping, if you're not in touch with swarms or you don't hang up swarm traps, is people like in Georgia or Florida or California, where it's warmer, will produce packages of bees with 1 queen and 3 pounds of workers, which they will ship, like they'll ship to you. Traditionally, like commercial beekeepers from New Jersey will get like a couple hundred of these things, and they'll sell them for like, let's say $125. And you'll actually meet them. They'll say, let's meet at the rest stop in the Garden State Parkway at the Cheesequake Rest Area, and they'll have a truck. They'll have a truck with a few hundred of these things on there, and you just buy a couple of them. You arrange ahead of time to buy them, and they just give them to you, and then you install them in your house, in your home, in your apiary. So it's kind of interesting. But the best way is to get natural bees because they're used to the winters here. A lot of times with these packages of bees, they're raised in Georgia and in California, and they're not used to the New Jersey winters, and a lot of times they don't survive,
Okay, we have a
All right.
couple more questions.
Okay, yep.
One, I think, is from a couple of slides ago. Why do they cap the larva in? Does that make sense still?
I think it's part of the development process, right? In order for the larva to mature to the point where it could emerge as a new bee, it has to get capped in, almost like a chrysalis or a pupae. It wouldn't have enough time to develop if that cell was continually open. That's what I think,
Okay. And then the next question is, will hornets go into the swarm boxes?
Yes, they will. That's why I try to, once swarm season is over, and in New Jersey, it really lasts. Honestly, it's over by about July 1st. You'll get smaller swarms and stuff like that after July. But by August 1st, I try to take all my boxes down because at that point, the chance of yellow jackets or hornets moving in far exceeds the chance of honeybees moving in. And then it becomes a real pain in the neck. Like basically you can't touch the box until the frost. After the frost, those hives will die out and you can go clean them out. But it's a real mess to clean out, like after wasps or hornets have had a chance to build a nest in there. It's a real pain in the neck to clean it out. So it happened to me once and I learned my lesson, and now I take the boxes down by August 1st. But that is true that they will move in there because it's a good home for them too.
Jim, can you tell us how you store the boxes in the winter?
You mean the swarm boxes or the boxes of bees? Well, I'll do it both ways. So the swarm boxes, I just
yes.
I stick them in the garage. I close them up so the mice can't get in. Then I just put them in the garage because they're just empty boxes that aren't really needed at that time. The beehive obviously lives through the winter. So really all you've got to do, the slow time of beekeeping is like after November. Once those bees have 60 to 80 pounds of honey, you basically just make sure they have a little ventilation on top because the bees generate a lot of heat. And there's a lot of moisture that they generate. So you want to make sure they can vent out that moisture. You want to make sure they have enough food. And you want to put a mouse guard on the hive because honeybee hives are nice warm places with plenty of food, and mice like that, and they will move into beehives in the wintertime. So you put a mouse guard on the front, which is basically a hole that the bees can get through, but the mice can't. And then basically from November through March, it's like plug and play. You don't have to worry about the bees. You could check in on them once in a while, but actually this year I had to check on them more than normal because we had a very, very warm winter. And a lot of times bees will burn through their honey because, if it's over 50 degrees, the bees think it's the springtime and they're out there flying around, but there's no nectar or pollen to bring in. So they're basically like expending a lot of energy and they have nothing to show for it, and they'll blow through honey very quickly in a winter like this. So sometimes you have to put like little sugar blocks on the hive to keep them going until the dandelions bloom in March. Okay, so this is the part that's fun, right? So this is harvesting honey. So you take a frame of capped honey, like you see on the left, and you take a capping scratcher, which is a fork, and all you're doing is you're pricking the cells to expose the honey. And you can save the wax to use for soap or cosmetics or lip balm, or there's candles. There's all sorts of use for beeswax. I put this picture down here in the bottom because I thought it was interesting, is that you can see that you've got a lot of dark nectar here, which is a different floral source, combined with light nectar in the same frame. So I thought that was very fascinating. And here's an example of an extraction where you've got two totally different shades of honey from basically from the same extraction experience. So these were off of two different beehives, and all it means is that the bees were harvesting, or they were locked in on different nectar sources, which produced like varietal honey. Like it produces a different taste and a different color. And traditionally, spring and summer honey is going to be a very lighter color, and the honey in the fall is going to be a darker, almost like sometimes it's almost like a buckwheat, like it looks like molasses in a way. It's very, very dark. And some people prefer that. It's got a more minerally strong taste. The spring honey generally has like a lighter taste. And then, so this is how, all right, so think about this, right? This is the big secret. You've got a frame of honey that looks like this, is completely uncapped, and then you're going to put it in what's called an extractor, right? So this is it's a cylindrical machine that you put the honey frames in, and you spin this wheel on the top. Now, the one I bought this year happens to be electric, so it makes things a little bit easier. But through centrifugal force, the machine throws the honey against the walls of the extractor, and then honey pours at the bottom. You strain it to get some excess wax out in like whatever little bee parts, honeybee wings and stuff. People don't want that generally in their honey. So you strain it, and then you bottle it. So it's as simple as that, really, when it comes to extraction time. And let's talk about honey as medicine. Okay, so propolis is a substance that bees collect from tree resin, and propolis is the Greek word for before the city, right? So pro meaning before, metropolis being the city. So this is stuff that bees use to seal up cracks in the hive, and to and basically put before the entrance of the hive. It's propolis. So what they found out from ancient times is that if you scrape that propolis down and you make a tincture out of it, it can be an immunity booster. It can help with cuts and scrapes. Honey is very good for coughing as a cough remedy. As a matter of fact, here's an old script that a doctor wrote in 1962. And I thought it was interesting that he's a pediatrician, pediatrics, right? One teaspoon of whiskey, 1 teaspoon of lemon juice, 1 tablespoon of honey. And take that as needed for cough. That's a good cough remedy. I might add a little more whiskey, but I thought that was interesting. Honey is used as a sleep aid because it regulates the melatonin in the body. People find anecdotally that it helps if you have allergies. If you consume honey that's made within 10 or 20 miles of where you live, because the bees are feeding on the local nectar and pollen, it's very helpful for people that have allergies. And honey is especially.
Oh, sorry. Somebody had a question pertaining to exactly that, asking, what is the best time to have the spring honey for allergies, during the spring or winter?
I guess because the plants are there all the time, it's whenever you have allergy season, right? I mean, most people have allergies in the fall and the spring, right? So I think if you were to have it in the springtime, I guess if you were to have it whenever, I don't have allergies, thank goodness, but if you were to take it whenever you feel it would be helpful, it's certainly not going to hurt you, right? So I would just try to play around with it and experiment with it, The main thing is, though, that honey is best consumed raw. So you don't want to heat honey above 118 degrees, because over that, it kills off a lot of the stuff that is good for you, for the immunity and for for your body within the honey. And that's a problem with commercial honey that we're going to get into, is a lot of the stuff that you see, because people don't like honey that crystallizes. they tend to be a nuisance for them. But over time, a lot of honey crystallizes. It depends on the amount of like fructose versus sucrose and what the bees have collected. But good honey will crystallize, and you can gently heat it to make it liquid again. But in an effort, because manufacturers know that people don't like honey that crystallizes, what they'll do is they'll superheat honey and they'll put it through a filter so that the honey in the little bears never crystallizes, but it also destroys a lot of the stuff that's really traditionally good for you in honey. And also I wanted to point out too that a lot of the honey that you're buying today is, they call it honey laundering. They will buy honey from China, and who knows what kind of chemicals and stuff they use in some of these countries. They buy honey in bulk through China, and it's repatriated through countries like Brazil and Argentina, so that the honey looks like it comes from there, and it comes into the U.S. and they kind of get around tariff laws and health laws by doing that. But there's a lot of funny honey out there, to be honest with you. Stuff that's honey that's mixed with corn syrup or rice sugar. So like the bear that you buy in the store, a lot of times is not really true honey. And if you do a side-by-side taste test, you will taste the difference,
Jim,
Yep.
let me ask you, given that so many people use fertilizers and pesticides in their garden, how good is honey for our health these days?
I mean, I think that the bees are pretty discerning. Like they're going to take what's best. They're going to take the best nectar sources, the best pollen that's out there. So, I mean, I'll put it this way. Like I don't, certainly that's a factor, right? Because everyone's using Roundup and everyone's using fertilizer. But I would definitely consume the honey that's produced by local beekeepers over the stuff in the store any day. It's about as natural and as healthy as as any kind of food that's out there, to be honest with you. So we're in the home stretch here. Just a couple more slides, and I'm happy to take some more questions. But I just want to say some things that I've learned personally about what beekeeping has done for me, and that the bee makes the bee such an admirable animal, right? So bees live within their means. So bees gather food when it's there, and they store it for when it's not there. So again, nectar is what keeps them going during the season. They put the honey away for winter, right? Honey is their winter food, but they have to eat every day, right? They have no bank account. They have no credit card. They can only consume in winter what they put away in the summer. So they always have to be prepared. And that's another thing too, that a lot of commercial beekeepers, what they'll do is they'll harvest all the honey because honey is more valuable than sugar. Then they'll feed sugar water back to the bees to get them ready for winter. But sugar water is like junk food, right? It's like eating pizza every day instead of eating what's nutritious. And that's not really good for that. That's abusing the bees, right? So you want to make sure that you leave enough actual pure honey on the hive to get them through the winter. But they can achieve extraordinary things when working cooperatively. So, 30 to 50,000 bees, they're a super organism. They have no ego, and a bee knows that it's going to die when it stings. It will sacrifice itself without a second thought if they feel that the hive is being threatened. And they will sting to defend the colony, not themselves. So they make decisions collectively. And there's an outstanding book by Dr. Tom Seeley from Cornell, which I'm sure you could get at Glen Ridge Library, called The Honeybee Democracy, all about how honeybees as a superorganism make decisions collectively for the good of everyone. And I think that maybe in this day and age, we could learn a lot from the way that honeybees conduct themselves, because they're very egalitarian in the way that they are, that they basically, and maybe that's why they've been around for 100 million years. They kind of figured it out. And what's beautiful to me is that bees are long gone by the time today's nectar is consumed, right? So a bee today is out there collecting nectar for a generation of bee that she is never going to see. They live 26 days in the summertime, but a hive can live indefinitely. So it's a completely selfless act for the bees today, thinking ahead about generations and putting aside for generations that they're never even going to know. And I think that's a great thing that we can all learn from. And here's personally what I've learned from beekeeping, right? So it's nice for me to be in touch with something that's really ancient, that's been going on for 10,000 years. And there's a sense of the infinite, that the bees will, who knows how long we're going to be here, but the bees have been here for 100 million years. They got it figured out. And I think it's a beautiful thing that they have an indefinite life, the bee species. And it's great to unplug in a world where we feel lost without the cell phone and the smartphone and the Wi-Fi. It's just great to stick your head in a beehive. And it's also great for social distancing, for obvious reasons. You're keeping 6 feet away from people. Nobody wants to get near you when you got the suit on. But so I have admiration and respect for the bees. Right? If a hive can work together with the honeybee democracy, we can learn to do the same. And I'm more aware of the nature that's around me. What's the humidity? How much rain has there been? What's in bloom these days? So it's just fascinating to watch the bees working. I find it very relaxing. So I just find it really cool. And also overcoming fear. So bees are very good. Bees actually sense fear. So the longer you're beekeeping and the more you act like you know what you're doing, the less you're going to get stung, because the bees sense fear and that puts them on edge. And that's why you smoke the bees down. So that's one thing I didn't mention, is that you smoke the hive to basically prevent them from transmitting their fear pheromone. But when the bees get stirred up, it smells like banana, like Laffy Taffy almost. Like when bees get really upset, when you start to smell bananas, that's when you got to close the hive up and just go visit another day, because they're about ready to start stinging a lot. And that's why you're never supposed to eat bananas before you go work a beehive, because you kind of freak them out. And then I appreciate the extraordinary amount of work that goes into food production. When you see how much work it takes the bees to produce even a tablespoon of honey, and how much time it takes you to extract it and to spin it out, you don't want to waste anything, and that's a good thing, And so here's some practical ways to help the bees. One is to buy local honey, if you can, from a local Essex County beekeeper. Again, not all honey is created equal. Real honey will generally crystallize. There are some exceptions, like Tupelo honey, which is a very sought after honey from the Panhandle of Florida. Tupelo honey never crystallizes, and it's very light in color. Again, the U.S. only produces 1/3 of the honey it consumes. So there's a lot of imports from China and India that are relabeled through other countries. They're thinned out with oils and corn sugar, and then they're heated and filtered so that they never crystallize. And that's not a good thing. So one important thing is to plant a pollinator garden. And I don't have much of a green thumb, but people on this call, I'm sure, do. You want to plant native blooming species, and you want to make sure that the nectar blooms. You have nectar that blooms throughout the season. And so I have a friend of mine is a former New York City cop, and he was the beekeeper for the police department. So whenever there was a swarm in Midtown, he would get called out to go capture the swarm. They called him Tony Bees. And he lives in Queens, and he lives near a school where he knows they don't spray and they don't cut the grass during the summer. So he takes Eden Brothers low clover by the fistful. And whenever he takes a walk in the school, he throws the clover down on the field. He's kind of like the Johnny Appleseed for the bees. And the clover comes up, and it's good forage for the bees. So that's an example of like something that you can do if you want. Also, I want to encourage people that if you're in touch with the shade tree commissions, to think about planting trees that are good for pollinators. Things like sugar maple, tulip poplar, and linden are great for bees. And if you think about it, one tree, because of the canopy, is equal to 2 acres of wildflowers. So really, most of the nectar that bees in New Jersey get is from trees and not from flowers, which a lot of people don't know. You can host a beehive or consider keeping one yourself. If people want to send me an email, Essex County Beekeepers is always interested in people that maybe, like, let's say somebody's running out of space to host a beehive, and they're looking for people that are willing to host a beehive. You can think about doing that if you want to contact me. It's kind of a cool thing. Or consider beekeeping yourself. Again, Essex County Beekeeper Society, we have meetings every month, and now we have them virtually. You can log in. We have classes. It's a really good group. I love the group. Honeybee Lives in New Paltz, New York, is a pair of folks that give classes, and they're excellent. I've taken several of their classes up in New Paltz, and they have a website you can check out. They're outstanding people. And again, I went to the Spikenard Farm Honeybee Sanctuary in Floyd, Virginia. And if you have any interest in like biodynamic farming, that's like a biodynamic paradise. That area of Virginia, which is down by Blacksburg and Virginia Tech, there's a lot of biodynamic stuff going on down there. and it's just beautiful. So it's worth taking a look there. And again, here's a list of major nectar sources in the Mid-Atlantic. And again, I'll share this slide with people. People can access the website anytime or the presentation anytime. But these are great for people that are gardeners. You know some of these plants. These are great plants and nectar sources for bees throughout the season. And again, you really want to do late summer, like milkweed, Joe Pye weed, purple loosestrife, which is an invasive species, but it's great for bees, blue mist spirea. These are especially important because that's a dearth in New Jersey. There's no nectar coming in. So if you could plant stuff that blooms during that time, it's great. Here's some suggested reading. Again, The Honeybee Democracy and Following the Wild Bees, which is about beelining by Thomas Seeley. Again, you can peruse these books at your leisure, but especially the movies at the very bottom. The Pollinators, which is free on Canopy, which is a program that's offered by the Glen Ridge Public Library. That's an outstanding movie about the role of commercial beekeepers and the role that they play in pollination and some of the problems they have with factory farming. It is a great movie. It's about an hour and a half, and it's well worth the time. You can watch it for free. There's a pretty cool movie called Bee People on Amazon Prime, all about, I think it actually includes people who keep bees in New York City, people who keep bees on the roof of Notre Dame in Paris. It's a very cool movie from like a cultural standpoint. Honeyland is an outstanding movie about, it actually won an Academy Award this year, about a rural beekeeper in Macedonia and what happens when the commercial beekeeper moves in next to her. It's a beautifully shot movie, and it's well worth the time to watch. And Yuli's Gold is an old movie with Peter Fonda about a beekeeper in Florida who actually harvests Tupelo honey. And that's kind of a cool movie, like from a drama standpoint. So again, thank you. I want to say, so this is a beautiful window. Travail is the French word for work. And this window comes from, my wife and I visited Quebec a couple years ago at the Cathedral of Saint Anne de Beaupré, which is about an hour north of Quebec. It's well worth visiting. And there's a beautiful stained glass window in the chapel in the back, which represents the sacredness of the honeybee and how important they are and how they really exist to work. And they're sacred not because they work, because they work for others. And that's just a beautiful way to end things. And I want to give special thanks again to the Glen Ridge Library, to Pretty and to Jen, and to Anna Diaz-Davidson, and to Joan Leskovich for being a great partner. And I do want to give a shout out to alottogrow.org. If you're not aware of the charity, A Lot to Grow is run by Patrice Kelly, and it's a very, very simple concept. Patrice modeled the charity on the urban lots of Detroit, which basically took urban lots and made them into raised bed gardens and grew fresh produce for distribution to food pantries and into the poor. And you can't get a simpler charity, right? To grow fresh food and herbs and to give it to those in need. It's an outstanding charity, and it's something to get involved with. Maybe to check out their website, to check out what's going on, and either to volunteer to harvest on harvest days or to donate. I really can't say enough about it because they just do outstanding work. So I want to thank them also. And having said that, that's it. So I thank you for the opportunity, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jim. I mean, that was a ton of information that I never knew about bees. So a lot of useful information. And we do have a few questions that popped up towards the end. Do you have any recommendations on where we can purchase local Glen Ridge or Montclair honey? And do you personally sell honey?
So, I mean, I'm not here to, I'll put it this way, right? I never know in the beginning of the year how much honey we're going to get. I never know what kind of year it's going to be. But if you do want to send me an email, my email is on the address there. It's jfeeney165@gmail. I'll put you on the list. And if I get an excess crop, I'm happy to share it. I'm happy to do that, obviously. But short of that, I mean, Essex County beekeepers I know my friend Mike Fry, who's got an insurance agency he's got an insurance agency in Cedar Grove. He sells his honey at the farm in Cedar Grove. And then Joe Lolino from Hilltop Honey. He's in North Caldwell, but he's in a lot of farmers markets and stuff like that. So I think if you Google local honey Montclair, you'll see that there's local honey around. But those are some sources. But again, if you shoot me an email, I'm happy to add you to my list. And also, again, like I'm happy to just call me anytime if you have any questions about beekeeping or anything like that. I'm sorry, Pri, I don't know if there was another question too. I don't know.
Yeah, there's actually a couple more.
Okay.
Next one was, if you host a hive on your property, are you more likely to get stung?
I don't think so. To be honest with you, I mean, this is going to sound crazy, but I've had hives for a couple years in Montclair, and the neighbors never really know that they're there. I mean, this year they knew they were there because there was a big heavy swarm season, and they maybe had bees hanging in their tree. But they were very cool about it, again, because the swarms are so docile. What I recommend is that people tell their neighbors. Well, first of all, New Jersey changed the rules on beekeeping. You're allowed, the state law overrode municipal laws that kind of limited hives. And I want to say that you can have like up to 2 hives per quarter acre of property. And but there are certain rules. Like there is a limit to how many hives you can have because it's a problem, and especially in like, if you watch that Bee People movie, I think they get into it with the New York City Bee Cop, where somebody in Queens on a small lot had like 60 beehives, and that's really where it becomes an issue because there's if there's robbing going on and stuff during robbing season, that's when it really can become a hazard. But I would say like 1 or 2 hives on a property, the bees they're so into their thing that you really, unless you got up right on them, you really wouldn't even know that they're there. I mean, I'm not exaggerating when I say that. And if you ever want to go look at the hives for a lot to grow are on Benson Street along the railroad tracks, and anybody can see them. If you walk along the tracks, there's 2 hives right there, and I wouldn't stand right in front of them because you're going to be in front of the bees' pathways. But if you stand to the side of those hives, you can just stand there all day long and just observe them, and they're not going to bother you whatsoever.
I'm sorry, where are these hives?
So a lot to grow. They have a garden on Benson Street in Glen Ridge, right along the old railroad tracks, right off of Ridgewood Avenue. So if you make a left on Ridgewood Avenue onto Benson and go down the hill, right before you cross the tracks, there's a lot to grow's facility there. And it's a beautiful facility. They built a greenhouse last year. And Anna Diaz-Davidson, who I think is part of the call, manages that garden. And we have 2 beehives there. So you don't have to, they're behind a locked gate, obviously, and they're behind a fence, but anybody can go to observe them, Oh, here, Anna Diaz, she's saying 76 Benson Street is where the garden is. So yeah, I would definitely encourage people to visit there. It's great, But really, again, you're only going to get stung if you literally have to step on a bee, or you have to open up a beehive without a suit or without smoking them and start messing with them to get stung. I mean, they're very non-aggressive, unlike yellow jackets or wasps, or hornets, which are very aggressive. Bees are not that way because when they're away from their hive, they have a job to do. They're not looking to sting people because they just want to get nectar or pollen and go back to the hive.
Let me ask you, Jim, someone asked, do you think Manuka honey is medicinally better than other honey?
So Manuka honey, so that's from New Zealand. Manuka honey is a very, it's another cause celeb in the last couple of years, where like nobody ever heard of Manuka honey 5 years ago. And then it kind of got this buzz that it's actually very good for dressing wounds, because honey is, it's medicinal and it's antibacterial. And it is very good for, I think they found out like in Iraq or Iran, that the Manuka honey, which is only produced in New Zealand, actually like clinically was very, very good for wounds management. But and actually, ironically, people used to throw Manuka honey out because it doesn't taste very good. It wasn't considered to have a very good taste. So it was kind of considered a junk honey in a nuisance for the beekeepers in New Zealand until it was found to have medicinal properties. But the problem is that, like, you know, the amount of Manuka honey on the market today far exceeds the production, the certified production of Manuka honey, which means that there's a lot of fake stuff going on, you know, in the industry. So, I mean, I think that it actually has a lot of medicinal properties, but I think there's a lot of fraud going on in the Manuka business. And actually, there's on Netflix also, there's a thing called Spoiled. I think there's a series called Spoiled, which is all about like poultry and different industries. And there's one on honey and the fake honey that's going on, and that's worth watching too if you guys have Netflix. But that's the deal with Manuka honey. It's better for medicinal properties than for taste, but there is a lot of funky stuff going on with that. You know, but true Manuka honey, there is a value. But even regular honey, if you have a cut or a burn, and you put regular honey on it, it's very healing.
Okay, and I think there was just one question that I skipped over. I apologize for that. And Jim, feel free to jump in if I'm not. Your question was, do you supplement with protein in the winter? Again, this was a few slides back. So does that?
Oh yeah, so like they sell these things called pollen patties that you can put on the hives, like which are made with like brewer's yeast and stuff like that. I really haven't done it. Like, I'm not a commercial beekeeper, and I'm not all about like increasing my numbers and trying to maximize yield. I'm kind of like, it is what it is. So I think that, you know, I don't use it personally, but if the big honey suppliers like Man Lake and Date Ant, they do sell pollen patties that some people do use as a supplement for the bees for the winter time. But I've never found the need for it. I think that there's enough honey, there's enough pollen production around here that they generally don't have to worry about it, you know. So.
Okay. Well, I think that's all the questions we have in the chat. If anyone has anything else, feel free to unmute yourself. Like I said in the beginning, we will have the recording available of the program as well as Jim's PowerPoint. And thank you, Jim, so much. This was so informative and extremely interesting.
No, I'm grateful to everyone, and I appreciate your attention to have like 35 people. It's a great honor to me, and I just want to say thanks to the Glen Ridge Library and think about a lot to grow. I mean, when you're considering volunteering or, you know, donating, it's an outstanding charity. So they do great work. So if you can learn more about that organization, I would definitely encourage you. But I say thank you for your time, and the PowerPoint's out there. So if you want to reach out to me, I'm happy to answer any questions or be a resource to you. But, you know, thank you for your time, and thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Okay. Have a good evening.
Great night.
I really appreciate it.
All right. So long.
Okay.
It was good.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim.
Thanks, Anna. Good to see you.
Same.
Thank you, Jim.
That was
Thank
wonderful.
you, Jim.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for
Do you,
posting also
do you
the-
see the bee in the background?
I do see the bee in the background. Yeah. Is that just for me?
Yeah, he's pollinating.
That's awesome. Thank you.
And he made honey. Okay.
All right.
Goodbye.
Have a good day,
Thank you for the
Bye-bye.
honey.
Good
Thank
night,
you.
everyone.
Thank you for the honey.
Sure. Enjoy it.
Bye. Bye.
Feeney, you got Mangans from Colorado on here too. Where'd they go? Feeney left? There he
I'm still on. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's good news. That's cool.
is.
That's awesome. All right. I got to log
Good.
off.
Oh, it's great. Thank you so
All
much.
right.
Good
Okay,
job, Jim.
Good job. Yeah.
Thanks
Bye.
again.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jim.